Hey, it's Mike here, and today my response to the large YouTube channel What I've Learned's video about a $212 billion food ingredient that's poisoning your brain, and spoiler alert here, it's seed oils.
What if a $200 billion food ingredient is shrinking our brains and making us dumber?
And how the oligarchs are controlling everything. He doesn't use that term, I just made it up right now. And in the past I've responded to him several times. Usually it's claims like processed meat doesn't cause cancer, him defending that, but we should have common ground on oils. I was criticizing oil before it was cool. Now you get 1 million views in 2 weeks like his video did, but I also look at it in the context of various diets and the research. You know, what foods are you replacing? Unfortunately, we don't agree on those foods, so we disagree in a lot of this video. And one of those areas I have to respond to is how he just seems to rewrite a lot of large chunks of human evolution. So we're gonna look at that, as well as a lot of research on actual oil consumption in humans, which he doesn't seem to cover at all. Anyway, let's go. He starts with the favorite anti-oil talking point, which is how like, oh, it was originally just an industrial lubricant. Here he is.
Canada produced tons of this stuff to lubricate ship engines during World War II. But after World War II, they didn't need all that lubricant anymore.
Yeah, they had so much left over, they had to take this inedible ingredient and force it upon the human food supply. But he continues trying to argue that it's inefficient using this cup here, which he says is filled with 70,000 seeds.
Because to produce just a tablespoon of oil, you need 70,000 seeds. To get this tiny amount of oil.
Now, because in the past I've seen him be blatantly wrong on things, and my intuition looking at that was like, I think you could get more than a tablespoon out of that. I had to fact check him, do the math. And directly from the Canola Council, about 45% of the weight of canola is oil itself. And to be conservative, we can say about 40% of that weight is successfully being extracted as oil, at least according to University of Kentucky, which says that we are looking at about 115,000 seeds per pound for canola. So his 70,000 should be about 0.6 pounds, which should yield about 0.24 pounds of oil, which happens to be 8 tablespoons. So he's off by a factor of 8. You know, I had to double check my math here because I thought I was crazy too. From another angle, it looks as if he has a 12-ounce glass there, and using similar size seeds, perhaps teff, to do a volume to weight calculation, we're looking at about 10 ounces of seeds in there, and then 40% of that being turned into oil, and then converting that to fluid ounces, and then once again tablespoons, we're landing at over 8 tablespoons again. I don't know. Why does this matter other than him just being wrong? It's because I think he's taking what is one of the most efficient ways that we have to create a fat source, which I don't think is particularly healthy in high amounts, as you know, but still helps feed a lot of people, and calling it inefficient. And then in the past, I've seen him go ahead and promote butter.
It's necessary to understand that saturated fat in general is not the enemy that it's been made out to be.
And as you may know, he's generally a low-carb, animal-based diet supporter here. And to show that he clearly still is throughout the video, he just clips low-carb presentations, as well as citing Nina Teicholz, who the beef industry described as like their biggest ally. But the point is that butter as a fat source is way less efficient generally. With whole milk, we're talking about 3.2% of it being fat. So if you're going to take his same 12-ounce cup, you're going to end up with roughly a tablespoon of butter. So yeah, the same inefficiency that he was mentioning with the canola wrongly. And it's also about production on a land. And it appears that we can many times get 2,000 pounds of oil off a single acre using canola. But if we're gonna graze cows instead, a dairy cow might require 2 to 5 acres, and they're gonna be making 7 gallons of milk per day. Compound that over an entire year. That every day for a year still makes less than 200 pounds of butter. It's between 5 and 10 times less efficient at making fat. And we'll move to the other claims here, but I should just mention, he's saying it's a $212 billion industry. Oh my God, you should be so scared of that. Well, the dairy industry is a $900 billion industry. So yeah, let's move on. So throughout the video, he does yo-yo between evolutionary arguments and direct current health arguments, and he starts off with some evolutionary stuff we can touch on here.
Around 2 million years ago, brain size started mysteriously increasing way faster, ending up with humans having massive brains way ahead of schedule.
Yes, humans are an anomaly in terms of intelligence, but where he goes next actually surprised me for a second.
One theory is that early humans essentially figured out how to cook wild potatoes, tubers, which gave them plenty of calories to fuel their big, energy-hungry brains. The human brain takes up a whole 20 to 25% of our calories, so so an efficient source of calories was very important.
I was surprised that he even mentioned this at all, and it is the case that we're seeing a growing body of literature for starch fueling the human brain. And even a new study published just yesterday mentions that starch adaptations are more than 800,000 years old, which is way older than Homo sapiens. Even a more recent study saying it could be fermented starch that helped, but...
Except this doesn't make that much sense because wild potatoes don't have any of the important nutrients the brain needs to grow. They're just calories. Hunting would be a much better reason for why our brains grew. Animal meat and organs would provide all sorts of critical nutrients for the brain, and animal fat would provide tons of calories.
And based off no studies, no data, he just dismisses it, saying, starch doesn't equal nutrients. Well, guess what? You can have a starch fuel component and other nutrient components of your diet, like eating a salad is for nutrition. But lightning fast, I think the case for starch is pretty great. I mean, looking to Karen Hardy and her team, she mentions that starch is literally chains of glucose, and the brain eats up a ton of glucose. So it can be really efficiently used. However, if we're trying to use animal fat for calories like he's saying here, we have to do gluconeogenesis, which throws away 30% of the energy. So you could be throwing away up to several hundred calories a day by just relying on mostly animal fat. I say that because they would respond by saying, oh, we were in ketosis, so we were just using ketones from animal fat to fuel our brain. But first of all, why would our brain prefer glucose? You put fat there and you put sugar there, your brain selects for burning sugar. And an animal in a survival situation is not going to be going, oh, I'm refusing to eat carbs so I can stay in ketosis and just leaving calories on the ground. No, ketosis is not the natural state, which is evidenced by how when we don't eat carbs, our sodium level drops, our electrolytes go out of balance. And that's why we see people getting a bunch of heart palpitations and weird side effects on a keto diet where they end up being forced to take electrolytes.
Electrolytes. That's where this video's sponsor, Element, comes in. Quickly found that they are a game changer when doing anything from a low carb or keto diet or just exercising.
Oh, what? His video is sponsored by an electrolyte company? Yeah, he knows his audience. But yeah, your brain needs about 150,000 calories a year of glucose to run. Starch is a great way to do that, but let's move to these different types of fats and which ones are good and bad, he says.
However, zoologist Dr. Michael Crawford thought that there was another piece to the puzzle. In the 1980s, he decided to investigate what types of fat there were in the bodies and brains of various types of animals. He noted that high levels of two fats helped make the brain grow, and there was a third fat that seemed to be bad for brain growth. The two fats that made the brain grow and therefore were very important for the evolution of the brain are arachidonic acid, AA, and docosahexaenoic acid, DHA.
So this is where he gets into the alternate hypothesis, really that fish grew our brains, which is one I haven't really seen claimed much before, as opposed to just meat in general. And in this case, he's saying that the DHA, that long-chain fatty acid, is what helped grow brains, it helps brains be more efficient, etc. And yeah, it is a significant component of our brain. Our brain is 60% fat, 40% of that is DHA, but it's also the case that plant-based ALA can be converted to EPA and then DHA. After all, the vast majority of a DHA molecule is just an ALA molecule. We just have to extend it a little bit. He rejects this ALA conversion aspect.
I mean, it's like humans and monkeys have enzymes that allow them to make a very small amount of DHA from a fat in plant foods. So to get a lot of DHA, you can't make it, you have to eat it.
Leaning on the research of Crawford, who claims that we evolved along coastlines and that all the other scientists are wrong about evolving in inland Africa, and it was the DHA from fish that grew our brains and made us human. And doing some really rough math, from age 0 to 14, we're gonna need to be depositing around 45 milligrams of DHA per day. We're not talking about like safe RDA values or anything like that, just what would be required to actually evolve this level of brain. And though it's lower in men, we can see that young, healthy women can convert 9% of that ALA from plants into that long chain DHA. And in this case, just eating like an ounce of walnuts would give you 2,500 milligrams, in which case they could convert easily 200 milligrams. And very ironically, canola oil is actually a decent source of ALA, where a tablespoon has, 1,300 milligrams. But these are modern foods which certainly wouldn't be available in pre-agricultural Africa where we evolved. Well, what did they eat, and did they get enough ALA? Looking into this study on Paleolithic African diets and dietary composition, they say that hey, these people were eating about 4% of their total energy as that plant-based ALA, which they say is, of course, way higher, even 10 times higher than the Western average. With a 2,000 calorie diet, that equates to about 9,500 milligrams of ALA per day. So even if you had trash conversion, you're a guy who has lower conversion, it should still be no issue there. And in researching this, I found some other cool things. Of course, there are higher ALA native plants in Africa. I mean, purslane is a decent one, but also that there are even some native African plants like liverwort and fern that have preformed EPA, which is that middle step between ALA and DHA. No, it's a long chain omega-3 fatty acid, and ferns are eaten by a lot of native cultures. And I should also just add that ALA is quite healthy from this study. High ALA was associated with 10% lower all-cause mortality. But this is where I do agree with him in that DHA itself just does appear to be healthy in various ways, which is why I stick by a lot of plant-based doctors recommending taking, a lower dose of 250 milligrams of DHA per day. For me, I'm thinking brain preservation, living past the age that our ancestors likely didn't make it. And he does go as far as to entertain the aquatic ape theory, which is very laughable in many ways, just in terms of the evidence. Here he is.
There's this old controversial theory called the Aquatic Ape Theory that says that humans evolved from an ancestor that adapted to life near bodies of water. Several aspects of our bodies seem more adapted for the water. For example, we don't have hair on our bodies, which would make it easier to swim. Now, most anthropologists completely reject this aquatic ape theory.
But it sort of plays into this whole everyone's working against us, the establishment is wrong. Oh, that's a $212 billion industry. Because of that, it's bad. Oh, does mainstream archaeology really know what they're talking about? But no, we lost our hair because we sweat. These whales, etc., do not sweat, and that helps us run and cool ourselves in a hot African Savannah Mosaic, which I will talk about in a second. Also, that our nose would help us swim underwater. I mean, if you see like a sea turtle, they clearly don't have a big protrusive nose. That's again likely to cool or heat air, just temperature regulation.
This may have something to do with why we started walking upright. Monkeys can walk on 2 feet, but they prefer not to, unless they are wading through the water.
And even mentioning that we evolved to be on 2 legs because of this is ridiculous. Again, we have like rebounding ankles from stepping on land, which we wouldn't get from flopping around in water.
Michael Crawford says it would be so easy and safe to just walk along the coastline and gather tons of nutrient-dense food versus having to hunt land animals.
There's so much wrong with that. And then I would also add again the evidence that we evolved in inland Africa, and freshwater fish, as this study mentions, has much lower levels of DHA than marine fish. So no, the main area that it's accepted that we evolved in is inland Africa. I'm sure there were some people living on the coasts, but we have what is likely a savanna tree mosaic scenario that we were growing our brains in. There is also a bit of a paradox here where, okay, we'd have to be smart enough to fish, but we'd have to get a big enough brain to be smart enough to fish, so it's kind of a chicken and the egg situation. And I agree with him that DHA plays an important role in the brain, and yeah, in certain cases, adding DHA can improve brain function, but here's the thing, did we require dietary DHA to build and evolve the human brain? I would argue no, and the evidence is just glaringly right in front of us, and that is that large populations of the world that are vegetarian are still able to grow a human brain and be just as intelligent. As much as low-carb people would love to believe it, vegetarians aren't by default suffering from some mental deficit. And as studies like this one find, children who are about age 6 to 7 that were born to vegetarian mothers have equivalent IQ and cognitive abilities to ones that eat meat and fish.
DHA degrades when you heat it. Lucky for Japan, they eat plenty of raw seafood.
And actually goes on this tirade about raw fish to preserve DHA, which I find pretty worrying, especially because of all the foodborne illnesses that can be caused. He really glorifies it without any warnings, yet we can see like Vibrio infections killing people and just parasites and other dangerous things, which I should just mention. And that's why I get my DHA from algae, which is where all fish get it anyway, which is worth mentioning. And then we can move to that dangerous third fat that he alluded to.
Now, there's that third fat that Michael Crawford said was important to brain science. It can compete with DHA for incorporation into the cells. That is, too much linoleic acid will hog up space in the cells so the DHA can't get in.
This is actually an issue I've talked about in the past, where eating too much oil and too much linoleic acid can decrease that ALA to DHA conversion. That, mixed with how people are getting dietary DHA, gives us a manipulated view of true human ALA to DHA conversion, in my opinion, which is supported by how studies like this show that non-fish eaters appear to convert more than fish eaters based on their blood levels not being as different as expected, given their lower DHA intake. But I actually view this as a point for linoleic acid's importance because it is essential, unlike DHA, so our bodies are like, give me as much as possible. It's just in this new modern environment, we're getting an overload of it, something I again agree with him on. But I do think it's weird that he came after canola oil so hard because canola oil is only 20% linoleic acid when we have, you know, sunflower oil and some of these other ones that are like 4 times that. They're way more of a concern there. And again, canola has ALA.
Land animals like rhinos barely get any DHA, but their plant-based diet gives them plenty of linoleic acid. So that explains why animals like rhinos are so dumb.
And he mentions that all the stupid animals like those rhinos and those horses eat higher linoleic acid and they're dumb, so humans eating more linoleic acid would make them stupider. Well, I think this is a massive oversimplification to look at intelligence based off one fatty acid, especially for other creatures that have like 84 chromosomes. They're just way different than us. But to emphasize real human studies showing that linoleic acid is generally healthy and important, from this study, yeah, the higher versus lower linoleic acid group had 15 and 21% lower risk of coronary heart disease events and death. Also, both linoleic acid and alpha linolenic acid improve cognitive function, depressive-like behavior, and anxiety behavior in metabolic-related dementia. And finally, the highest versus lowest category of linoleic acid resulted in a 13% lower risk of all-cause mortality. Now, we're probably getting these signals because this is replacing saturated animal fat, which of course raises LDL or bad cholesterol and is causally linked to atherosclerosis. However, I do agree that whether it's being converted or eaten directly, some of the benefits of DHA could be lessened by just an exorbitantly high intake of linoleic acid. But this is where I would totally flip the script on him and say, hey, well, guess what? Even eating too much DHA, which is, you know, putting the golden crown on here, leads to negative effects with even a way higher level of evidence than he's presenting here. For example, randomized control trials show that at higher doses, like 1 to 2 grams higher than these vegans are recommended to take at least, we see a increased risk of AFib of the heart, and that's atrial fibrillation, which is a heart rhythm abnormality. This is not something you want. And then also we see an increased risk of prostate cancer with high levels. And another one that I found was really interesting is he started sort of glorifying Japan and saying, oh, they eat so much fish and they are healthy and long-lived. And he shows this school lunch.
In Japan, school lunches are planned out by a nutritionist, and it's standard to make them fresh from scratch every day.
And I'm like, look at all those plants in that school lunch. And he's saying that they're eating lower linoleic acid and oil. And it's, yeah, because they're replacing it with plant carbohydrates. However, as a commenter mentioned, they still eat a lot of canola oil, and yes, directly from this site. Canola oil is the main oil used in Japan. And yes, several times he mentions this, oh, rhinos and horses dumb, cetaceans and dolphins are smart because they're getting that DHA, but he completely ignores some very intelligent creatures such as orangutans and chimpanzees and elephants to an extent that are not getting any preformed DHA, yet they are, depending on the intelligence metrics, equivalent to dolphins.
In 2018, Norwegian researchers revealed data that IQ scores started to slightly decrease for men born after 1975. The lead author, Ole Roseberg, says that similar studies in Denmark, Britain, France, the Netherlands, Finland, and Estonia all found the same thing, a trend of decreasing IQ.
Now we get to what I just view as a wild oversimplification of a claim. Oh, we had the food pyramid introduction of oil and the oil consumption massively increased, and then everybody got stupider because of oil. I'm not saying it was just oil, but it was oil.
The dietary guidelines for Americans were introduced in 1980 and recommended we swap animal fats like butter and lard for vegetable oils. It makes you wonder if this could be a factor in why the IQ increase in Americans slowed down right around 1980.
First, I just have to say, as he mentions later on, that there are a lot of factors that influence intelligence. I mean, just being sedentary can do it. We're talking about chemical exposure, which was happening really on a large scale for the first time. And we have things like PCB and lead from fish as well, ironically. And there are things like drug use, new drugs coming on the market, and just really interestingly, not that it necessarily increased, trauma can knock a good 7 or 8 points of IQ off. But to just crush this fishy argument about IQ, to registered dietitian Jack Norris, who covered Crawford's claims, he mentions Norway, which has some of the highest fish consumption in the world. Well, they did see that similar IQ drop, from the 60s, it dropped down even more in the 70s and lower in the 90s. During these periods, we saw an increase in fish consumption. So if we want to rely on just large population habits, we can say that fish makes you dumb. However, we're going to look for higher quality evidence than that. And he covers some scary stuff saying that linoleic acid in higher amounts shoves out DHA and can be making people stupider.
Then, 5 years later, a 2015 study found that, as expected, children with mothers who got too much linoleic acid experienced negative effects to brain development.
The problem is, looking to a study on this like this one, they didn't adjust for dietary quality. And it's the case that when you're getting really high linoleic acid, perhaps it's also an association with processed food consumption, fried food consumption.
Fried foods are, of course, fried in vegetable oil.
Maybe even more sugar with those processed foods, yet we still saw some positive epidemiology effects. But as this study even mentions, quote, "We cannot rule out the risk of confounding in such observational study." I don't know if that was grammatically correct.
Higher linoleic acid in the mothers when they were pregnant was associated with more symptoms of autism spectrum disorder when the children were 6 years old.
And it kind of gets next level when he implies that high linoleic acid intake could be causing autism, which, it's a red flag when some particular thing causes autism in my book. Again, from blocking DHA, but looking to this study, I don't think that a 20% difference in DHA levels would just cause autism. And now we get onto heart disease. You just know I love this topic, and his claims here I just can't take it. Here he is.
The American Heart Association today recommends that for heart health, we get 5 to 10% of our calories from linoleic acid per day. But this means that the AHA suggests that we eat 5 to 10 times the amount of linoleic acid that we ate in 1865. 1865 was before seeds were crushed into oil and widely sold for human consumption. Now, the first heart attack was recorded in 1912.
Yes, the first heart attack ever in human history was in 1912, and clearly this is all because of oil. Firstly, it's no coincidence that around 1912 was the first time in human history that life expectancy broke 60 years of age. But what he's referring to is really one of the first modern cases of a measured heart attack with more modern instruments. It doesn't mean it was the first heart attack that ever occurred. Gosh. And we have descriptions of heart attacks in ancient Egypt, and we also have atherosclerosis in a large portion of mummies from ancient Egypt. They had heart disease too. Hippocrates in 400 BC references what very clearly was a heart attack in a patient. We have very clear descriptions of heart attacks from 7th century poets, and we see pathological or diseased hearts from buried, preserved nun hearts in the 15 and 1600s. And in the 1700s, we find a thrombus in the coronary artery of an autopsy of somebody with chest pain. But that's all in the past. Why don't we look at actual modern human data? We have a study of 500,000 people, which looks at things like canola oil and butter, and they found that canola oil trended lower heart disease mortality and statistically significantly lower total mortality, when butter was associated with a 7% increase in total mortality and 8% increase in cardiovascular mortality per tablespoon. So for every one of those 12-ounce cups of milk you compress into a tablespoon of butter, you get 7% more heart disease. It also goes off on how the linoleic acid content of breast milk is too high, and that could be leading to issues.
Going back to why infant formulas have so much linoleic acid, the thing is, they're trying to mimic breast milk, and women's breast milk does have linoleic acid. However, the composition of the breast milk depends on the mother's diet.
But I just have to say, he talked about how Japan was so great to this study. They actually have a slightly higher linoleic acid breast milk content than Canadians who invented canola oil.
As of 2019, Japan is #1 in the world for IQ.
So by now, I think you can just see the absurd amount of contradictions that he makes in pretty much every single aspect. There's a solid argument for why it wasn't the case. And I wish I had time to cover all of his points. If there are any important ones that mattered and I didn't get to, let me know in the comments down below. But here is what I would consider a concise summary of his main points and my main rebuttals. Finally, I should say, if you're confused about my stance on oil here, I've done several videos on it, and I do believe that there are scenarios where, you know, someone eating a whole food, oil-free vegan diet by adding a bunch of oil is just going to increase their LDL. That's not going to help them. But in a normal dietary context where we're replacing these saturated animal fats with unsaturated plant-based fats, that's going to lower heart disease, which we see from the studies. In the end, with what I've learned, I just really don't think his points are adding up. I think he's kind of absolutely riding the high of this anti-seed oils campaign that's going on, which I wouldn't be surprised is somewhat pushed by the animal fat industry. Who knows? Maybe I'm talking conspiratorially here, and now you believe me. But he didn't even show any direct studies on canola oil consumption and disease outcomes, which again, I did, and they were better than butter, which as we've seen in the past, he supports. And of course, him pushing this evolutionary stuff, like even just entertaining the aquatic ape theory and all this idea that we have to be eating preformed DHA when it doesn't add up. And I'm sure in the near future, he will again make another low-carb animal diet supporting video that I'll have to respond to. But I would just say, if you do like this, there was no sponsor in this video, so feel free to check out my Patreon and support me. That's a huge help. And then for my Costa Rica trips, the first one that was full, a couple people moved over to the second one for scheduling. So we do have a few spots open on both of those trips, which I will be on. So link below to those. And of course, feel free to like, subscribe, all that good stuff. And I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.